What happens when the sensitive heart of the empath ceases to be a blessing and turns into a curse? At first glance, the empath seems like a gift to the world, a person who feels the suffering of others, who instinctively rushes to comfort, who listens without judgment. But beneath this luminous surface lies a fragile truth. The more the empath gives, the more they feel themselves disappearing. Their life becomes an endless cycle of attending to the wounds of others while neglecting their own. What begins as compassion slowly mutates into exhaustion, depletion, and even resentment. Carl Jung warned that whenever we deny our true self, the unconscious begins to revolt. Every time the empath silences their own needs, every time they smile instead of expressing their anger, every time they play the role of healer while secretly bleeding, a debt accumulates in the psyche. And that debt does not vanish. It becomes the shadow. The collapse of the empath does not usually arrive suddenly. It comes like water eroding a stone, quietly, invisibly, until one day the stone breaks. Friends, family, colleagues may see the empath as strong, endlessly available, a source of comfort. But inside, the empath is unraveling. Their body grows heavy, their heart feels hollow. Their mind begins to whisper cruel questions. Why am I never cared for? Why does no one see me? Why do I feel invisible while giving everything I have? This is the moment of collapse, when the empath realizes they have lost themselves. Jung described it as a rupture between persona and self. The persona is the mask of the good one, kind, selfless, endlessly giving. But behind that mask hides a storm of rage, longing, and unmet desire. The collapse is the moment the mask can no longer contain what has been repressed. And yet, collapse is not only tragedy, it is also invitation. In that breaking, the empath begins to glimpse the truth. Their sensitivity is not the enemy, but neither is it the whole of who they are. The collapse shows that their light has a price, and that price is the shadow they have denied. Over the next 24 minutes, we will walk through this dangerous terrain together. We will uncover how the shadow consumes the empath, how their deepest gift can become their greatest curse, and how, if faced with courage, this fall can transform into individuation. Because when the empath is consumed by the shadow, the end is never the end. It is the beginning of becoming whole.
Why is the empath so vulnerable to being overtaken by their shadow? The answer lies in boundaries, or rather the lack of them. For the empath, the border between me and you is thin, almost transparent. They feel others' emotions as if they were their own. This is both their power and their downfall. Because when everything enters, nothing remains contained. Imagine a bucket with a crack at the bottom. You pour water into it, and for a moment it looks full. But the water drains endlessly, and no matter how much you add, it is never enough. This is the life of the empath with fragile boundaries. Every joy, every sorrow, every fear of others flows into them and flows out of them, leaving them perpetually empty. Jung would say that this fragile container is sustained by the persona, the mask of goodness. The empath learns, often in childhood, that being the kind one earns approval. But this mask has a cost. Behind it, real emotions are buried alive. Anger is repressed because anger feels selfish. Desire is silenced because desire feels greedy. Even the simple wish to rest can feel like betrayal. And all that is disowned does not vanish. It sinks into the shadow. Here lies the paradox. The empath wants to heal others, but in doing so, they wound themselves. They give so much light that they forget the darkness growing inside. Over time, the unexpressed shadow becomes heavy. It shows up as guilt that cannot be explained, as resentment that feels shameful, as sudden waves of despair without clear origin. And so we ask, if the empath continually represses anger, longing, and selfhood, where does all of it go? The answer, as Jung revealed, is unsettling. What we refuse to live consciously, we live unconsciously. The shadow holds it all, and eventually, it demands to be heard. But what does the shadow of the empath truly contain?
Every empath carries a silent vault inside them. At first, this vault seems harmless, a place to lock away the anger, frustration, and selfish desires they fear would hurt others. But over the years, the vault grows heavier. Jung warned that the unconscious is not a graveyard where feelings go to die. It is a living reservoir, and everything buried there continues to breathe. Think of every time the empath says yes when their body is screaming no. Every time they offer forgiveness without processing their own wound. Every time they smile while their chest burns with unspoken rage. These choices may look virtuous on the surface, but they are seeds planted in the soil of the shadow, and seeds grow. Slowly, the empath's light turns against them. The love they once gave freely begins to feel like duty. What was once joy now feels like an obligation. Empathy, their defining gift, becomes a prison they cannot escape. Jung would call this the revenge of the repressed. Everything denied in consciousness returns with doubled force through the unconscious. The empath begins to sense it in subtle ways. A sharp tone in their voice that surprises them. A sudden bitterness when helping someone they once cared for. A daydream about abandoning everyone just to feel free for once. And then the guilt. Crushing, relentless guilt. What kind of person thinks these things, they wonder. But Jung's answer is clear. The kind of person who has silenced their shadow for too long. This is not weakness. This is not failure. This is inevitability. Jung taught that the shadow is not an enemy, but a neglected part of the self. When the empath represses their anger, their desire, their selfishness, they are not erasing it. They are simply letting it accumulate, drop by drop, until the dam breaks. The paradox is cruel. The empath tries to be good, and in doing so, creates the conditions for their darkness to grow stronger. They think they are keeping the peace, but what they are really doing is delaying the storm. And when the storm arrives, it does not whisper, it roars. So the empath finds themselves trapped, obligated to care, silently resentful, consumed by guilt, and increasingly haunted by feelings they cannot explain. Their inner world feels like a house with locked rooms, each one filled with echoes of a self they were not allowed to be. But this raises a deeper, more frightening question. When the shadow finally bursts through, what happens to the empath then?
There comes a point when the vault can no longer contain its contents. The shadow does not ask politely to be integrated. It forces its way into the light. For the empath, this often takes the form of relationships that mirror their own wounds. They are drawn to the very people who exploit their kindness, manipulate their guilt, and drain their energy. On the surface, it looks like bad luck, but Jung would call it fate, the unconscious arranging circumstances so the shadow cannot be ignored. At first, the empath remains the victim. They feel trapped in cycles of abuse, unable to break free because guilt whispers that leaving would make them cruel. But over time, something darker emerges. The empath, once only giver, may begin to manipulate without realizing it. They use silence as punishment. They guilt others into staying close. They control through sacrifice. In short, they become what they feared,
an instrument of the very shadow they tried to escape. It is like a candle that has burned too long. At first, it illuminates, then it flickers, unsteady, and finally, when it extinguishes, all that remains is darkness. The empath, consumed by the shadow, no longer shines for others. They become lost in bitterness, passive aggression, or emotional control. This is the nightmare state, the empath inverted. Their sensitivity, once a bridge to love, becomes a weapon of unconscious power. Relationships collapse under the weight of resentment. The empath feels alienated from themselves, unable to distinguish between genuine care and hidden control. And yet, Jung's vision was not despair, but transformation. To be consumed by the shadow is to be confronted with the most urgent question of the soul. Will you remain a prisoner of unconscious patterns, or will you begin the painful journey of integration? Because here lies the secret Jung left us. Being consumed is not the end. It is the threshold. But is there truly a way out of this labyrinth?
The shadow is terrifying only when it is denied. Once faced, it loses its monstrous shape and reveals itself as part of you, not an enemy, but an exiled companion. For the empath, integration begins with a radical act, allowing themselves to feel what they have spent a lifetime repressing: anger, desire, the need to say no, the wish to rest. Carl Jung insisted that individuation is not about becoming perfect, but about becoming whole. The empath who integrates their shadow does not stop being compassionate, but they stop being consumed by compassion. They learn that boundaries are not cruelty, but clarity. They discover that saying no can be as loving as saying yes. And most importantly, they realize that their own needs are not selfish, they are sacred. Picture an alchemist at work. In the old traditions, poisons were not destroyed, they were transformed. Mercury, sulfur, lead, dangerous substances could, in the right process, become gold. The empath's shadow is the same. The venom of repressed anger can be turned into the medicine of assertiveness. The weight of suppressed desire can become the fire of authentic passion. The guilt that once enslaved them can be reshaped into responsibility for their own soul. Integration is not easy. It requires courage to admit, I am not only light, I am also shadow. It requires humility to see the ways in which one's goodness was also control, one's sacrifice also resentment. But the reward is liberation. When the empath allows the shadow a voice, something extraordinary happens. The endless cycle of exhaustion breaks. They no longer give because they must, they give because they choose. They no longer seek to save everyone, they begin to save themselves. Their relationships shift. They attract those who respect their boundaries instead of exploiting them. And slowly, the empath feels something they thought they had lost forever: inner strength. Integration does not mean the end of suffering. It means the end of unconscious suffering. The empath still feels deeply. They still hurt when others hurt, but they are no longer drowning in it. They have learned to stand on solid ground, even while others are caught in the storm. The path of integration shows us a paradox that Jung understood deeply. Only by embracing your darkness can you truly embody your light. And this brings us to the final truth. What happens when the empath rises from the shadow reborn? To be consumed by the shadow is not destruction. It is initiation. The empath who passes through this fire does not emerge weaker, they emerge transformed. They are no longer the fragile healer who bleeds themselves dry for others. They are no longer the martyr who equates suffering with love.
They have touched their own darkness and survived it. And because of this, their compassion is no longer naive, it is wise. They can feel the pain of others without losing themselves in it. They can offer support without carrying the entire burden. They can walk away from those who exploit them without guilt. In Jungian terms, they have moved from persona to self, from the mask of the good one to the fullness of the human being. The reborn empath carries a presence that others can feel immediately. Their boundaries are firm, but their heart is open. Their voice is calm, but their eyes are clear. They no longer give out of compulsion, they give from abundance. They embody what Jung called individuation, the becoming of a whole person, one who is united light and shadow into a single flame. This does not make them invincible. Life will still test them. Old wounds may still ache. But now they know the truth. Their sensitivity is not their curse, and their shadow is not their enemy. Both are parts of a larger whole, and in that wholeness lies strength. So when the empath is consumed by the shadow, it is not the end. It is the most important invitation of their life, to stop being merely a mirror of others and finally become themselves. To cease living as a reflection and to rise as a soul made whole. Because in the end, the shadow does not devour you to destroy you. It devours you to demand your awakening. And if you accept its invitation, you will discover the paradox Jung left us. The deeper the darkness you embrace, the brighter the light you carry.